For some guys, they don't ever have fun until, several years into the big leagues because they've literally been pitching wrong the whole time. There's a lot of pitchers that have reached their ceiling in one version of themselves, but if they're pitching in the wrong style, there's a whole new untapped version. I frequently tell them, like, just replace the word fastball with your worst pitch.
Brian Bannister, welcome to the Tread Podcast. Appreciate having you here.
Yeah, great to be here.
Awesome. I'm joined here with Tyler Zombro, one of our coaches. So appreciate you guys tuning in. Brian, we're excited to talk to you. Got a ton of questions. But first, I know we wanted to just kind of get a little bit of background, talk about your story. Obviously, you pitch in the big leagues. You're still coaching at the highest level. Give us like your story in 3 to 5 minutes.
Was very blessed. My dad was the number 1 overall pick in the draft, so grew up in the game. I never had the same kind of talent as him, but was exposed to a lot of elite pitchers early on, watching their training habits, how they went about their craft, their problem-solving process. Was exposed to, kind of innovators like Tom House really early on in the early 90s. So just kind of through osmosis, got a great education in the game of baseball, and that carried me through. I was small in high school, a walk-on in college, kind of just barely made it to each progressive level, but always found a way to, try to compete and try to get the most out of my ability, which was always my goal. It was never to be the best player in the world. It was just to keep getting the most out of what I had physically. And then my rookie year, my first full season rookie year in 2007 with the Royals, Pitch Effects came out. And so, we had just gotten past the steroid era.
Mm-hmm.
And so guys have been doing that, but that wasn't really an option and not a road that I wanted to go down. But data was kind of my steroids. It's like, okay, here's the next thing that nobody's using that could be the next performance enhancer. And so I really got into it. My physical ceiling was lower, was limited, but I had a great teammate in Zack, who had all the upside in the world and who was very cerebral and really wanted to soak up the information. So we spent 4 years in Kansas City together. I would just be digging into the data all day, almost acting like an analyst, trying things out, passing along to him. He'd be asking me questions. We were iterating through a lot of things. And it kind of culminated in his 9-war season in 2009, winning the Cy Young. And that's when I knew, okay, my career is not going to be about me as a player. It's going to be, how can I leverage this data to make other players more talented than me be better at their own careers? And that's kind of where my passion is. So I retired in 2011, had torn my rotator cuff, and spent a couple years doing research, and then accidentally stumbled into a job with the Red Sox after speaking at a conference in Boston for my friend Dan Brooks. And it was just an amazing journey. Right place, right time. The core position player group they had there with Bogarts and Mookie Betts, etc. We went on a crazy run and culminated at 2018 World Series. And then I've got a couple kids, so I missed my kids and got back to the West Coast with the Giants, where I am now, director of pitching. So we won 107 games, set a franchise record 2 years ago, which was a blast, and really just getting prepared for next year, have another great year.
You touched on, obviously you made it to the big league, so you have some degree of talent, but how you weren't always the biggest, the fastest, the strongest, or the most talented. How do you feel like that affected ultimately your, desire to, be the best, having always been kind of the underdog growing up? Like, you were a walk-on, I was a walk-on. Were you a walk-on?
No, it was not a walk-on.
Not a big recruit. I mean, do you feel like that affected how you approached the game from an early age? Versus if you had just already thrown 95 rolling on bed in high school? Like, how did that affect how you approach things versus maybe some of your teammates at the highest level who, threw 100 miles an hour, but maybe didn't have to work as hard to get there?
I think there's some guys that are extreme athletes. There's some guys that organically just move the right way to be very successful at baseball. I was neither of those. And so for me, it was just a lot of thinking, like, how do I get more out of my ability? What are the inefficiencies in the game? Just always asking questions. My favorite part of baseball is talking. It's sitting in the dugout or sitting out in the bullpen or in the locker room, talking with guys about the craft of pitching. And that's where I got all my advantages. So just my lack of physicality, my lack of talent upside led to me just being passionate about the details that most people don't care about. And I think that's what I've been able to pass on to other guys, is just really watching the things as a second set of eyes that nobody really cares about, but that ultimately compound over time and help them be better players. And that's probably my favorite part of the game.
I think there's a perception in the game that like being cerebral as a pitcher can sometimes be a negative thing. Like you just want to not think, just be a robot. Like some people will say like the dumb pitchers are lucky because they don't have to think when they're out there. But I mean everything you're saying is like there's definitely an advantage to at times being a cerebral guy who can leverage the data, who can leverage this additional information that is out there. So what would you say to kind of the cerebral guys who've, you know, they're trying to like bottle that up versus tapping into that? Like how do you balance being cerebral and leveraging that without overthinking when you actually get on the mound?
You know, we talk about motor preferences, how guys like to move. There's also kind of intellectual preferences, like how they like to relate to the game.
Right.
And my advice would be kind of find the yin to your yang. Like if you're a really, really smart guy, find somebody who can simplify it for you. Because you can, I've been there, you can take it too far. And then if you don't like dealing with data, find somebody who can do it for you and still give you great advice on how to keep improving. If you don't want to put in the time in that area of the game and you just like focusing on the physical training or just the raw throwing, really just find somebody who's a good complement, because the game is so complex now that it's not a one person journey. You really want to be a part of a team and collaborate. And so it's really just matching yourself up with somebody who has strengths that are your weaknesses.
So for you, obviously it's been an interesting couple of years. Um, During the whole lockdown situation, you actually started giving lessons. So I'm really interested, and and Tyler and I were talking about this before the podcast. Like, how did that kind of shape your coaching, having to, you know, not only be able to coach and relate to the most talented players in the world, but also be able to simplify it down to a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old in kind of like a lesson format. Has that forced you to simplify or change your coaching approach, or take some of these really complex topics and change how you explain them depending on who you're actually working with? Has that made you a better coach? What was your experience overall, kind of making that pivot during the lockdown or during the kind of last couple of years?
Yeah, it's funny from going to Kevin Gosman and being part of helping him get a $110 million contract to helping a 10-year-old. I'm,
Right.
I'm a big fan of the Feynman principle. Like, explain everything like you're explaining it to a 5-year-old. And one of the good things and one of the techniques I use is always using metaphors and analogies and other sports, and rarely talking about just raw data straight up. I don't think that's a totally effective way to communicate to players. We forget 90+% of anything we hear anyways. But if you tell it in a story form, people tend to remember it. And when they're out there on the mound trying to make adjustments in game, they'll remember a story or a metaphor, but they won't remember exactly what data point you gave them
Right.
several
Right.
weeks ago. So I tend to err on that side, which it converts very well to a younger demographic. And I'm passionate about helping amateur players, amateur coaches, kind of just bridging that knowledge gap. I've been very blessed to have so much exposure to high end analytics for 15 years now, and I feel like if you don't help the younger generation keep up, they might lose interest in the game, because everything we're so passionate about for those that have access to really high end tech happens at a microscopic level, and then they don't get to experience it, and all the little discoveries and small adjustments we get so geeked up about, they don't even know what we're talking about, and they just watch the game from more of a macro perspective. So I love the concept of let's bring them along for the ride, and let's make sure the next generation is both educated and can participate in everything we're doing at the major league level and at the higher levels of amateur baseball, so that they find it fun and
Mhm.
they feel invested in it versus being excluded because they can't afford the tech, etc.
Where do you start then with a young kid, or even with a big leaguer who you're working with, where you're trying to maybe add a pitch, or you're trying to assess their arsenal, or even just introduce like a 12-year-old kid to the data side of it? Because obviously you don't want to just dump everything on top of them and completely reinvent everything they're doing. So what's your kind of starting process for a pitcher comes to you, they're like, I want to add a pitch or help me make my arsenal better?
I have this thing, I call it the pastime framework I've kind of developed over the last 15 years. So I just have a series of steps that I go about with any pitcher. And really what I start with is their tilt on their fastball and their spin efficiency. And spin efficiency is kind of this weird data point in that every system measures it a little bit differently. And it's Rapsodo tends to be a little high on it. TrackMan doesn't even give it to you. people don't have access to Hawkeye, which measures it exactly. So usually I'm watching on a high-speed video and doing my own calculations on where they're at from a spin efficiency perspective. But I always consider that the baseline. And so I compare a lot of things to golf. If you were going and getting fitted for a driver in golf, they just kind of take your baseline swing path, attack angle, etc., and fit you for a driver. And that's how I start out a session is I try to figure out, okay, where's his arm slot at from a tilt perspective? And then, his right left rudder, where's his spin efficiency at? And I can really start comping that to my just mental library of all the pitch grips and all the guys in the big leagues that I've worked with over the years and studied, and I can really accelerate their development process. Because once I know where their fastball starts with, that's kind of the foundation for me. And then pitch grips are just offsets off of that. So I kind of have hacks to get them going. The thing you deal with in younger pitchers is just the variability of repeating their mechanics.
Right.
And so you're dealing with that element, but you're trying to upgrade their arsenal at the same time. So I tend to err more on the simple side because if you give them even a decent changeup or breaking ball, they're so far ahead of the game
Right.
if they're an 11-year-old. And so they go out and dominate. And it's fun to get text messages from the parents like he had his best game ever.
Right.
But I try to make it fun. I try to make it story-like, and I try to give them little development hacks just to kind of accelerate the process relative to their peers.
At that age, how much do you feel, or how important do you feel it is to kind of master the basics of repeating their mechanics, of stride direction, arm timing, like some of the basic mechanical kind of guardrails before introducing a ton of additional variability with, because you can give a 10-year-old like a nasty curveball, but then, set aside like some of the concerns about health, which may or may not be real. Should they be leaning into all these other aspects of the game, or should they be mastering the basics first and then progressing to that? Like, will you start working on that stuff with a kid who can't do 5 push-ups and his mechanics are all over the place, or will you try to master some of that stuff first?
With even the big league guys, my whole philosophy in pitching is increase the margin for error with command via stuff. When you improve stuff, everybody misses, nobody hits their spot every time, and you just increase the likelihood that it's going to be a successful pitch. And if you take that concept even down to the younger demographics, I preach athleticism, fast tempo. You'd be amazed how well they understand the stretch shortening cycle. I do a couple demonstrations just to take advantage of that concept. We get into length tension relationship. They totally get it once you kind of show them how it works. And once you start improving their athleticism, even if they can't repeat, because most of them can't repeat, they just don't have the stability and the functional strength, but they get in there, and as long as they're close to where they're trying to throw the ball, the increase in kind of stuff plus, or whatever you want to call it, just the overall pitch quality, it really lets them go out there and makes the game so much more fun because they can miss their spot, they can lose their balance and still get a really nice result, strike a guy out or get a ground ball, get a pop-up, and all of a sudden the game becomes alive to them versus if you just preach repeatability when they lack functional strength, when they just lack the overall reps to be able to do that, the game can be very robotic for them, and everybody's evaluating them on did they hit the glove every time, and it can become a lesser version of the sport for me versus let's be a good athlete. Let's bet on the fact that you're going to get better at your command over time with more reps, and as you mature, your functional strength improves, and you just get better at understanding what you're trying to do with your delivery. In the short term, let's just be an athlete. Let's move fast. Let's have fun. Let's understand a couple of these physics concepts that will boost your stuff, and let's know where in the zone it plays, and let's know how to pair another pitch off of it. And pitching can be really fun even at younger levels.
Everything you just said kind of touches on this idea of variability, repeating your delivery, athleticism. You tweeted a quote a few weeks ago from Rob Gray, his book, How We Learn to Move. And the quote that you pulled out was, "Skillful movers in the same discipline do not all coordinate their movements in the same way. There is significant inter-movement variability between performers. Skillful movers do not achieve their goal by moving the same way every time. There is significant intra-movement variability within performers." So this idea that, everyone moves in their own unique way, and then even within your own unique way of moving, rep to rep, set to set, whatever you're doing, whether it's pitching, whether it's, doing a bench press, whatever you're doing, it's going to be unique every single time. How does that influence how we should be coaching players? Should we be trying to teach them to do the exact same thing every time? Should we be leaning into being athletic, throwing from a ton of different arm slots, a ton of different foot positions, playing the infield, playing the outfield? Like, how do you view this idea of athleticism, variability, and what might coaches be getting wrong from that perspective?
Greg Rose at TPI talks about it a lot. What's better, shooting 1,000 free throws or shooting 1,000 shots around the court if your goal is to make more free throws? Like, what is the better approach? And I like the variability approach. Like, do things that increase your ability to make adjustments. Everybody likes to throw around pitchers are elite compensators, and it's true, they are, but let's find ways to challenge them. Even in catch play with the younger kids, I do all kinds of weird throws, like let's walk backwards, and then you can't let your left foot touch the ground, and you have to throw off your right foot, almost like a shortstop fielding backwards. And you can see them processing it, and it's a very neuro activity. Like, how do I organize my body to make this throw and try to hit him in the chest? And when I do catch play, I do a lot of weird drills like that because they're rarely challenged. They just all day long just step the same way, try to hit you in the chest, and then all of a sudden game circumstances change, and there's runners on base, and the pressure's on, and they start losing their composure. And how do they make those little adjustments to still execute and do what they're trying to do? So I'm just a big fan of, let's challenge pitchers. Let's have them be more athletic. Let's do different things, different sports, different activities. Some of the best pitchers I've ever been around were great ping pong players, etc. Like, let's just do a lot of complementary activities. And ultimately, I think it shows up in their ability to make really fine motor adjustments on the mound.
Is that kind of linked to what your definition of athleticism would be? Because a lot of people have trouble defining what exactly is athleticism. Is it like the guy who can just jump 40 inches or is super strong? Or is it, like, to me, it has more to do with what you just described. It's the guy who's like, almost no matter what you give him, he's like going to be good at it. It's that guy. So like what is that idea, like that phenomenon? Is it just that they have this adaptability to changing environments? They can organize their body depending on no matter what you throw at them. Like, how would you define athleticism in that context?
I played golf up in Michigan with Zack Greinke, and we played a course, and it was rolling like 13, 14 on a stimp meter, insanely fast. And me being, less good at adjusting and making adjustments, a lower athleticism ceiling. Right. I remember first green, I literally putted it off the green, and Zack watched that, and he just on the spot made an adjustment and ended up shooting like 75 that day on a really, really tough course that had been groomed for a PGA major event. And it just shows that some guys just have the ability to be good at whatever they put their mind to. And I think they're better when they actually try more activities, kind of the David Epstein range approach, like just be a generalist in order to be a specialist. And I just love that concept. And so, just doing the same robotic thing every day with pitchers, I don't think is the best way to train them. Let's challenge them. Let's challenge their balance. Let's challenge, what we put in their hands, different weights, different sizes, and let's just make it really tough. And then when they get something that's consistent every time, it almost feels easy. I love that approach of make practice really, really hard, and competition in a game becomes easier, or at least feels easier. It feels like a placebo.
That's something we talk about a lot, is trying to find like the challenge point in practice, because everyone just throws like easy bullpens. There's no standard hitter. The catcher's not calling pitches. If they, spike a curveball, there's no consequence to that. Like, they're just in their comfort zone. They're never being forced out of that comfort zone. I mean, obviously you get in season, now you're having to pitch out of a jam. You're having to, locate an off-speed pitch in a 3-2 count, to the 4-hole hitter. Like, you're being put in these pressure situations in games, and then very rarely do pitchers actually practice with any remote degree of pressure in terms of what they're doing. That also brings up, something, one of the previous podcasts I did, talked to Daniel Bard, and he said, like, now there's so much more creativity in how he's pitching. He's not trying to just like mimic the exact same thing. He's like allowing himself to just kind of have fun with it. Like, he has the end goal in mind, like, where am I throwing this pitch? But then there's a ton of different ways that he can organize his body to get to that point. Just like the basketball example, like you can do the exact same thing from the free throw line, or you can shoot that same shot, get the same outcome from a ton of different spots on the court. And he brought up Nestor Cortez, and I just think it's cool that the game is starting to wake up a little bit to that idea too. Like, you can throw, like, Clayton Kershaw can throw a couple pitches from sidearm, just out of nowhere and still find a way to throw a strike and throw 95 that way.
One of my favorite activities, I just call it a chase bullpen, is you literally start out, you throw a pitch, and then wherever it ends up, it doesn't matter if you hit your spot or not. The next pitch, you have to tunnel off of it, and you continue that process throughout the entire pen. So it's all based on the previous pitch, and the next pitch has to have a relationship with that pitch, and then that's where your aim point ends up. Or at some point you reset and contrast it to the opposite side of the zone and start all over again. But there's just no pre-planned format, and you're challenging yourself to just execute based on the previous pitch, because that's a lot of times what happens in games. The hitter only sees what you give him, and he doesn't know what your original intent was. He's reacting to what actually happened. And so being able to build on top of that is a great way to take a practice session into a game, because it really works from a tunneling perspective, visual deception perspective, in being able to not just hit the catcher's mitt, but actually build upon your previous pitches. And so it's a really fun way to gamify it, especially for younger kids. I've had great success with them in just, okay, I don't care where you throw it, but the next one, we're going to have some kind of relationship to that previous pitch.
It also just makes them aware of what they're doing, right? Like they can't just like catcher calls a pitch, they're just throwing it, zero awareness of what's going on. They now become like a designer in that process. They're way more in tune with what's actually going on in the sequencing. That's not something I ever, put a ton of stock into, high school, college, even in the minor leagues. Like I wasn't paying as much attention to those types of things because I wasn't training in that particular fashion. It was more just like catcher calls whatever he calls. I'm going to throw it as hard as I can in that general area. Whatever happens, happens.
I know you've talked about command related stuff, and you alluded to it there with the hitter doesn't know where you are intended to throw a pitch. And I know, speaking from experience, sinker ball type guys, we have specific zones we target to allow a margin of error. How do you relay that sequencing of guys? Like, I think it relates to the chase theory there. Like, if I'm targeting out or third to allow deviance for the sinker to still play, how do you relay that to guys?
Anytime you have an east-west arsenal, which is just what I call usually a sinker arsenal, like you're dealing with more horizontal movement than some guys who are more vertical in nature. You really have to make the plate feel wide to the hitter. So you see, as we've learned more about the analytics and run more machine learning over the years off of the hundreds of millions of pitches that we have in the big leagues, like the up and in two-seam fastball to a lefty, and you're trying to figure out, how do I force bad swing decisions with hitters, knowing that, they're just hunting my sinker. Sinker ballers sometimes, have to throw a lot of sinkers. And so how do I take one pitch and get really creative with it and do different things with it? And also, force the hitter to have to, get on his heels, get on his toes to handle it. That up and in two-seamer to a lefty followed by a strike the ball two-seamer away makes the plate feel really wide. If you're running, 14 to 20 inches of H-break on your sinker, and the plate's 17 inches wide, you can make the plate feel like it's 40 inches wide to those types of hitters, and they can't cover that. And so it's just not trying to hit the glove, but trying to go, okay, how can we make the zone feel massive to this hitter where he starts to make worse swing decisions as a result.
I do want to go back to your swing analogy though, because I love that. And you were one of the guys who initially introduced supination, pronation, bias to me, bicep tricep dominance, which made a ton of sense to me right out of the gate. And I think about your experiences working from Cy Young winners, guys who are making hundreds of millions of dollars, to young kids. And this is something we've talked about in some data videos, but looking at natural force application to the ball and designing the arsenal off of that, off of what the guy is good at. And we know like carry became very popular. Coaches were kind of forcing that, altering mechanics. And I think your analogy there is great. But if you could just talk about what you've seen based on those biases from young kids all the way through the big leagues.
Parents look at me funny when I'm working with an 11 or 12-year-old and I tell them like, all right, let's scrap your changeup. Like, we're going to go two breaking balls. And I think that's what you're ultimately going to be. And like, they just give me this crazy look. But then I go, okay, what does Justin Verlander throw? What does Clayton Kershaw throw? What does Garrett Cole throw? What does Shane Bieber throw? And you start breaking out all the guys that don't throw a changeup. and they're Cy Young caliber pitchers, and it forces the parent to do a double take. Like, well, I guess those guys are pretty good, and they don't throw a changeup. So would you rather spend your time doing something you're really good at that has synergy with your natural strengths, your natural motor preferences, or do you want to waste your limited reps as a pitcher? We only get so many throws off a mound, and we have to recover. We're not like hitters where we can just take hundreds of swings every day. Would you rather, spend those reps on what you're ultimately going to be good at, or try to do something that's going to be mediocre and maybe use it 5% of the time someday? And so I've had a lot of success even convincing parents, especially the 13 and 14-year-olds, where now they're starting to build some functional strength, starting to prepare for high school and travel ball and the showcase circuit and all those things, getting recruited. Like, let's make your practice time more valuable by eliminating things that ultimately I don't think are going to raise your ceiling very much. Let's actually find out the things that are going to raise your ceiling and make you a better player. And you're investing in yourself. Those practice sessions are going to compound over time. And so it's super fun to see the reaction, and you actually see a sigh of relief in the player, because he'll try to throw a changeup and he can't do it, and he knows it, and he actually starts dreading having to practice it, versus you tell him, to throw a cutter and a curveball, and all of a sudden he's just ripping them off, and all of a sudden pitching is more fun. So I try to play off that, and just my experience over the years is like, let's just go with what they do naturally, and let's not try to fight it just because some pitchers have a great changeup. Doesn't mean you have to have a great changeup.
Would you be able to, for people who aren't familiar with the supination pronation bias, like explain that idea, and how would someone watching this like be able to tell which group they kind of fall into? Is that just experimenting with breaking balls, changeups, and seeing what they feel more comfortable with, or do you have a specific way that you look to see kind of what bias they naturally have in terms of how they apply force to the ball?
Probably the easiest way is when you throw a breaking ball, can you create horizontal sweep on it? That's usually the easiest way. Does your curveball have more horizontal break than downer break? Is it easier to throw two different breaking ball shapes or more? You get into the Musgroves and the Bowers and the Walker Buellers. They throw tons of shapes. Generally, if you can create big arm side movement and very small cutterish breaking ball movement, you're more pronation bias. And then if you can create multiple breaking ball shapes, especially if you can sweep the ball to your glove side horizontally, much more supination bias. And that's a really quick litmus test on what you are. There are guys that are more neutral in nature. I mean, there is a whole spectrum, but a lot of guys are really extreme in one or the other. And for the pronation guys, the Zack Greinke's, the Max Scherzers, the Pedro Martinez's, the Jake DeGroms, it's usually power cutter, really big changeup depth, and then it because they almost can't create power on a curveball.
Right.
And most of them just dump it in as their fourth pitch. And that's a really good clue that they like to create extension, tricep dominance, pronation bias, however you want to describe it. And then something where they have to bring it in, almost centripetal force, bicep dominance, shorten the radius, however you want to describe it. They can't create power that way because that's not their motor preference. But they effectively use it. Zack is famous for his 59-mile-an-hour curveballs,
Right.
and Scherzer dumps it in. Kurt Schilling used to do it back in the day. Pedro, like, there's no power to it, and that they're really known for the power changeup, or a short little cutter. But it's just finding that synergy and just rolling with it, as opposed to fighting it for a really long time and ultimately delaying getting the most out of your career.
Do you see any sort of connection between that type of motor preference and just general range of motion? So like we'll assess like pronation, supination in our movement screen, and when we see someone, so like me for example, like this is my non-dominant arm, my throwing arm, like I'm very limited in supination. I've always struggled to create any sort of big sweep. So one of the things we look for is like if a guy's super limited in supination, you almost know right off the bat he's not going to be able to create that huge sweep because he's not going to be able to get around a breaking ball. And then if they're super limited in pronation, same thing. Do you do any sort of like movement screening there, or are you more just curious in terms of what actually happens to the pitch on the mound and using that as kind of the evaluation tool?
I mentioned that pastime framework earlier. My actual first step in everything, and just how I went about problem solving when I first got into pitch data in 2007, there were no certification courses. There was nobody who had used it before, nobody to teach me how to wade through all this data. So I actually stumbled upon, a problem solving framework, and it's called inversion. And some of the hardest math problems in the world were solved backwards. They actually started with what they believe the answer to be and worked backwards. And so I just started with, well, what do the Cy Young winners do? And I started studying their data exclusively and working backwards. So to answer your question, me just, I'm not a CS. I'm an art major. I think weird abstract ways and I come up with alternate ways to problem solve. So I have actually always solved from the plate forward. I just really have them throw some pitches, and whatever happens, then I go back to the assessment and try to find correlations between, okay, how is the wrist put together? But sometimes it even gets complicated because their wrist might be one way, but then their other joints might also have, other positions that actually counteract it. So it's hard for me to just assess a wrist and go, oh, you're supination bias. It's way easier for me just to, all right, just throw a pitch, and I can tell usually within 5 pitches what your bias might be. And then let's go back and do the assessment and figure out how those add up to create that motor preference.
That takes into account the idea that you need to look at all the information in front of you while being able to weight, obviously weighting the actual functional skill more, but still being able to look at the entire picture. Like there might be some different variables going on, the strength or stability side, a back foot, super tight pronator or flexor limiting their supinator. There might be something else causing it, but you first want to understand what's actually happening as like the end result. I know we wanted to kind of pick your brain about this idea of like leaning into what makes people different. Talk a lot about pitchers having quote unquote like flaws or anatomical flaws, when in reality like that can actually lead to some of the most outlier pitch quality that you see at the highest level. A lot of coaches will try to force pitchers to conform to like a specific mold, whereas you're taking the complete opposite end of the spectrum. It's like, what makes you special? Where are you different? Where are you kind of like weird? Let's do more of that. So what's your philosophy on like figuring out the outlier qualities in a specific player?
One of my favorite thought exercises is, let's say you're talking to a group of 20 pitching coaches, and there's a hack attack machine, and it's just sitting on the mound, and you tell them, okay, you can turn the dials to any setting, you can place it anywhere on the mound, you can use different tripod legs to adjust the tilt of it or the height of it. Where do you put it? Like, create the highest pitch quality pitch you can using this machine. And it's funny because most of them have never thought about it, and they kind of freeze, like they don't know what to do. But it's something that I've gone through a million times, is like, okay, if we could get a pitcher to actually release the ball from this position, that would be like the best pitch quality I've ever seen. And
Right.
I'm just fascinated by kind of thinking outside the box. How can we screw up hitters the most by giving them something they've never seen before? I'm just fascinated by the fact that hitters hit off of, it used to be the old Casey machine, the 2-wheel machine, now with the hack attacks, but they hit off 12-6 fastballs, and that fastball doesn't exist in baseball. Right. You're literally practicing something you will never see in a game. There's always some amount of gyro spin to it, or, even Kenley or Mariano, there's a little bit of cut spin to it. You just don't see that pitch, and yet that's what you practice off of. So the world is 90% right-handed, 9 out of 10 people on earth. Most people throw from roughly the same release point. So what a hitter sees every day and what he practices every day, his dad was most likely right-handed, his coaches were right-handed. I just think that's fundamentally why left-handed pitchers, same fastball quality, characteristics, same velo, they outperform their righty counterparts, is because you just don't see it as often. So there's less of, kind of a sample size for hitters to base off of. So in getting back to the outliers, you're trying to find combinations that are at the tail ends of the bell curve. You just don't want things that hitters see all the time, because ultimately all we're trying to do is get them to miss by a little bit. Ideally, they miss by an inch or more and we get a whiff, but even just generating a pop-up or a ground ball, it's mission accomplished on the pitching side. And so there's something about, the combination of their release point, their pitch characteristics, the visual experience of trying to hit off that guy. Is there a hitch? Is there a weird timing mechanism? Is he on a different tempo, a different beat? I love when Justin Verlander or Houston Street start at one place on the rubber and then slide, because hitters orient themselves to usually how a pitcher sets up on the rubber, and all of a sudden you shift on them and hitters are like, do I shift with them? Like, all those weird little quirks, right, I think compound on each other. And so the more of those things you can put into a pitcher, I think the harder the hitting experience is.
How do you kind of link to that? Like, how would you train for deception? Obviously, like you can tweak the pitch grip, you can try the movement profile of a pitch itself, but have you ever like specifically tried to get a guy to stride more crossbody or counter rotate more to hide the ball, or like are there different ways to train deception besides simply just making a pitch better based on spin and movement type of profile?
I think it's a combination of arm action, horizontal stride angle. Like people get sick of me because I want to close everybody up. When you run correlations in the lab, hip shoulder separation, basically the more linear you can make a pitcher because shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, you do boost velocity. And there's high correlations with all those data points. You see Driveline doing the open biomechanics stuff right now and posting all the correlations. And so the more linear you make a pitcher, the harder he will throw. But nobody's really trying to quantify visual deception. And I just remember going back to the 27 at-bats I had in the big leagues, and I got to face some of the best pitchers in the world, like Steven Strasburg, his rookie year when he was punching out everybody, Eric Bedard, who led the league in strikeouts, Ben Sheets. Like, I can remember the guys. I literally couldn't see the ball. And that feeling has stuck with me forever. And it's usually something they're doing. Cleveland's really big on getting the glove up in the release point window. I love that concept because anybody who's ever used a camera, and I'm a photography major, when you put something in the foreground, the lens, if it's on autofocus, focuses on that. And then you take it away, and it takes a split second for it to refocus on the background.
Right.
So a human eye works the same way. You put something in the foreground, and then all of a sudden you take it away. The eye has to find that new focal distance where the release point is. So even just disrupting it with something little like that, I know that Cleveland's really big on that. Those are all things that add up to better visual deception. My teammate in AA was Yusmeiro Petit, who all he did was every day in the mirror try to hide the ball behind his torso. And, he had massive extension. I remember throwing a bullpen after him, and his foot was landing like a foot past mine. And he made a great career out of throwing 91 miles an hour. Some great World Series performances, just always pitched above what we would typically consider his pitch quality. And it was because of his visual deception. And he actually actively worked on it every single day. And so I give him a lot of credit. He got 10 plus years in the big leagues, focusing on visual deception, probably when most people don't think twice about it.
Do you think we'll get to the point where we can quantify visual deception in a more accurate way? Or is that something where it's going to be more of the art side of coaching?
I think there's guys that kind of have a visual deception ceiling that's lower than others.
Right.
Ultimately, if you can get into your scap load with your hand behind your torso, and then you can get, into your max external rotation behind your head, and then as you rotate forward, your hand, you get huge external layback where it's hiding behind your elbow, and you have a close stride, and you have a funky tempo, rhythm, hitch. It's just all those cumulative elements add up to more visual deception. And then you typically see.
So there's going to be there's a list of checkpoints of things that could be seen as deceptive, and the more of those that you hit, theoretically, the more deceptive you would be. Like if you have the guy with the glove arm and the crazy hair and the crossbody, like Josh Hader, for example,
Yep.
and hiding the ball and weird arm slot and outlier pitch quality, like you just keep checking all those boxes, that's going to be a more deceptive guy.
Yeah. And my favorite, like the really thick torso.
Yeah.
I shared a
Bartolo
jersey with
one.
Bartolo, so
Yeah.
I'm a biggest Bartolo fan. And so, you look back at the guys who are really barrel chested, you just couldn't see the ball off them. The Kurt Schillings, the Roger Clemens. There's an element of it versus if you're extremely skinny, the hitter you don't occlude the ball very well, and hitters just see it often. And any visual information you can give them just helps them in, analyzing both final location of the zone and the 3D path of the baseball.
I think outside of maybe sunbathing tan gloves for deception, I want to circle back to the player side of things because you're an outside the box thinker. I personally am more of a logic based thinker, but seeing an athlete's experience, knowing on-field performance, like how much more mental clarity is there when you bring guys in, tell them what they're good at, let them embrace that and really hone in on those strengths? Because I think we can talk about the biomechanical factors behind it all day, but you being a major league player as well, talk about a lot of the mental clarity that goes in behind that, because I think that's something that carries a ton of weight.
One of the things that I've leveraged throughout my coaching career is going, now that we have data, we have literally timestamps of movement quality and pitch quality throughout a player's career. And it's kind of like, being a paleontologist, like you're going back in time, you're looking at what they did then, and then you're like, let's do that again. I've been able to do that successfully with a lot of players. And so many players are always chasing like the next big thing versus, hey, you were actually pretty good at this point in your career. If you just went back to that, you might make $20 million next year. And there's a lot to be said for making $20 million. And so I love, one of my sweet spots is kind of that 29 to 35 demographic of big leaguers who at one point were really, really good and really, really locked in. And whether it's they thought there was a better version of themselves, a higher ceiling version, a coach or org sold them on going a different way, whatever the reason that they changed and they kind of got out of what they did well. And big league hitters were telling them that it was a productive way to pitch. That's all I need to see. And getting really good at recreating what they did in the past is one of my favorite things. And it's something I've been able to exploit for years. And it's fun because I don't have to teach them something new. Their body already knows those patterns, knows those motor preferences. I don't have to fight them or retrain them or build up that proprioception. It's already there. And once they actually start moving that way again, they actually start to love the game again, because they remember they had success at some point in the past doing that. And if you just tell them like, that's good enough, like being a 3-WAR pitcher in the big leagues is good enough. Like we're not all, a 7 to 9 WAR guy. And right now you're not making much money. The reason you're here is because, you're looking for more upside, but you had the upside. Let's just get back to it. And that's one of my favorite ways, just to talk to pitchers and go, that's good enough. And they find just a lot of peace in that concept.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because I mean, we have 100+ major leaguers now, and I would venture to say, for more than half of them that have 3+ years of experience, so much of what we do is they're looking for the next thing, the new thing. And we've spoken on a few examples of this, but we just need to go back to where they were. And I think reverse engineering that based on ball flight data, knowing if there was an injury history, how are they moving, what's the compensation, is there something anatomical, physiological now? But I would say, seriously, majority of our guys are just reverse engineering back to that.
Yeah, it's figuring out what they did well in the past. And for me, the cool thing is like there's so much instant buy-in when you can relate to what they've already done. Like you go back, you figure out like, okay, maybe 2016, this was the best version of themselves. They've gotten away from X, Y, Z. If you can go back and explain it to them exactly how they used to move, what their mentality used to be before XYZ injury, it like instantly clicks, and now you have complete buy-in and confidence in terms of what they're doing. Like I'm thinking specifically of Kyle Wright is a good example. Like his entire identity of as a pitcher was kind of changed through the first few years of his career. It's like, hey, we need to just get back to your strengths. Your strengths are power curveball. Your strengths are attacking the zone. And he'd gotten away from all these things. You explain that, and he's like, that makes complete sense. I just wasn't confident in that pitch, but now I understand what makes that a good pitch and why it was a good pitch. And so now, like, you give them their blueprint, they can go and they can execute on that blueprint without someone telling them they have to change X, Y, Z. And they never really were fully bought into that. It never really quite felt right. So I guess can you speak to that, like the buy-in side of things? Do you find that like there's instant buy-in when you can relate to them on their own motor preferences? Or will you sometimes make a change that doesn't quite feel right to them and just encourage them like it's gonna eventually feel natural?
I think the biggest curse for a pitcher is a guy who can light up the radar gun, but he has either low spin efficiency or no plane, no approach angle to his fastball. But he feels this burden that because I throw hard, like I have to use that. And for those guys, I frequently tell them like just replace the word fastball with your worst pitch. Right. And let's just throw your worst pitch less, because that means your other pitches are better. And so you did a great job with Kyle, and similar to like Logan Webb, that project. There's those guys that haven't ever experienced what their ceiling is because the pieces haven't been rearranged in the right pattern yet. So they're still searching because they've never experienced it. versus what we just talked about, where they've experienced in the past, and then they thought there was another higher ceiling, and there wasn't, and they actually kind of torpedoed their production. But when you get the buy-in, when you get them moving the way they should, it feels right. The motor preferences are syncing up. You know, you're actually educating them on like, this is your bias, this is how your arm wants to work, and they start seeing it in action. And then ultimately, when the hitters start telling them, "Hey, this is nasty," and they start having fun. For some guys, they don't ever have fun until, you know, several years into the big leagues, because they've literally been pitching wrong the whole time. But the old way was, especially if you threw hard, you had to throw your fastball a ton. And so for somebody like Kyle, you know, you guys talked about just throw your breaking ball harder. I mean, he has an elite ability to throw a curveball in the mid 80s, and it's gross. And he goes out there, you know, wins more games than anybody in baseball. Like it's so fun to see that. And that's just a pitcher finally firing on all cylinders and figuring out who he truly is, and not just kind of following that archetype of like, I got to be a power pitcher. You know, I just make the ball curve and move better than anybody else, and let's just go with it.
Awesome. You touched on fun a few times so far today. Do you try to actively encourage fun through the process, or is fun like is fun the signal that you've done your job? Like, is fun the emergent property of getting them in line with their motor preferences, getting things timed up, giving them solid pitches, improving their stuff, and then fun emerges once they start to see success? Or do you actually try to encourage them to have fun like through the entire learning coaching process itself?
I mean, you can kind of break it down into three parts. There's fun in understanding who they are and the mastery of the style they should be pitching in. You know, Logan Webb was trying to be a 97 mile an hour four-seam pitcher, and once he found peace with, you know, I can throw 93 miles an hour, so 4 miles an hour less, but I can make the ball sink as much as anybody on planet Earth. And knowing that you're as good at that as any other human on the planet, there's just like some joy in that. So that's fun. And then when you know, you start facing the best hitters in the world and you're getting them out on a consistent basis, even in division opponents where you're facing them multiple times throughout the year, and they know what you're going to throw and you're still getting them out, that's fun. And then ultimately when you get paid, that's really, really fun.
Right.
It's kind of the, you know, the cherry on top.
I think that's interesting because it's giving them, it's explaining to them what their identity as a pitcher is, so they can latch on to that, versus like, I have to throw 97 miles an hour because that's what I think that scouts and teams, I think that's what I think everyone's looking for. When in reality, it's like there's a million different ways to skin the cat. This is your special sauce, and as a coach, if we can give them their identity and get them comfortable in that being their identity. Like, Sombra knows he's not going to be a 97 mile an hour righty, but he's found his identity as a, you know, crafty righty, sidearm guy, like can sink the ball, can spin it. And so that just gives them a lot more comfort in terms of like, here's how I need to go and actually attack and execute my game plan.
I had to throw 40 to 50% cutters to even compete at the big league level. But several times I was a 2 to 3 WAR pitcher. So for a guy that, you know, my average heater was 89 to 91, to, you know, go out there and throw 180 innings and have some fun and make a little money and really just put on a big league uniform and get to experience, you know, old Yankee Stadium and Fenway, and, you know, come out to Sweet Caroline in the 8th inning and, you know, go head to head with John Lester. Like, all those memories I have were so worth it, and I would have never gotten to experience them if I hadn't just gone, my fastball doesn't play, I just need to throw cutters. Like, that's my identity. It's what I have to do. I just need to do it.
I think talking on the reverse engineer back to where somebody was before. So we've talked about creating that buy-in, but if you could elaborate like on a Logan Webb example, because I think creating that overhaul transformation, if you want to call it an ego death of sorts to a profile that maybe they previously existed in, how, and you can use Webb as an example, but like, how do you create that buy-in for them to commit to that process, know it's going to work? Similar to like a guy who's never seam shifted a sinker, but we know the axis, the efficiency, the orientation will play. How do you convince them to follow through on that?
So in that example, you know, when there's not a point in the past with a pitcher that I have to go back to because the story is yet to be written, I'll often look to somebody else, another, I call them templates, where the story has already been written. It's already a proven way to get major league hitters out. There's more risk in increasing a pitcher's, you know, physical strength, perceived biomechanical quality, whatever, but there's not a proven template in the big leagues that'll actually lead to production in the big leagues, which is where most players are trying to get. If you're dealing with amateur players trying to make, their varsity team, trying to get a college scholarship, it's a little different because you can tweak their attributes a little differently. And lower level hitters, you can get them out with just more of a velo focus, etc. But when you're getting to the best hitters in the world, you want to go with proven patterns, proven arsenals, proven shapes, etc. that get the best hitters in the world out time after time after time. So for Webby, it was Corey Kluber. That was exactly what I went off of. So I didn't use his career and previous pitch data from his own career. It was copied off of what Kluber had already done, winning the Cy Young Award. And so I just kind of like borrowed it from Kluber and applied it to Webby because they shared so many similarities in their pitch data that we knew we could get them there. And so that was part of the sell, is like, hey, you have all these characteristics. It's literally like a dead ringer. And even within that, Kluber was more of a cutter guy. Webby ended up having more of a changeup preference, but the template was the same. And we were able to kind of guide him, what I call nodal arsenal design. So you're actually finding a 3D position space, a node that I call it, which leads to all these elite pitch shapes. And so by kind of guiding him into that, similar to where Kluber was, we were able to kind of build Webby off of that into a proven template. And, now he's a top 15 starting pitcher in the world. Even though he hadn't done that in the past, we were able to use somebody else that was kind of a dead ringer for him and just have that certainty that we could get him there.
Yeah, I think that's powerful because we obviously on the data side we'll use comp models. Obviously biomechanical, we can get down that rabbit hole as well, but how they apply force to the ball, etc. And so thinking about that, and we use examples in-house internally. If somebody cuts a ball and they're 80% efficient at 130, like I'd be negligent not to mention Clay Holmes, right? But talk about that with Webby, for instance, but with all this arsenal construction, how from a biomechanical standpoint, you weren't ultra changing anything that he was doing.
It's hard because the pitcher has all these years of training built up where he feels like he's throwing it all away. If you're like, well, I don't think that's the style of pitcher you should be. And he had gone through a Tommy John surgery. He'd gotten to the big leagues, which is every pitcher's dream, and had a 6 ERA. And there's just kind of that, it's tough to get there and stumble or just not be able to achieve what you thought you were going to achieve and not see the correlation between all the work you put in and the results. So sometimes, and I actually prefer this, is to wait for periods of failures with pitchers. That's the best time to get buy-in. I just call it like sowing the seeds when the ground is fertile. And I always love when they're, what do you got for me? That's my favorite question from a pitcher is, what do you got for me? They just kind of like sheepishly walk into a conference room or your locker and they just sit down and, what do you got for me? And you just know they're ripe. And the best thing you can do as a coach is already have done all the research, memorized all their data, know exactly where you want to take them, what direction, how you're even going to go about doing it, all the steps for that very question. And it's happened, the first time it happened to me was Rich Hill. And, he was ready to retire and he was 36. He'd been in the big leagues, but he's just wanted to spend time with his family and was just like, do I still have what it takes to be a big leaguer? And I was like, you have one of the best curveballs in the world. Have you ever thought about just saying, what do I have to lose? Go out and throw your curveball 1,000,000 times and see what happens. And that was literally the first PD conversation I ever had with the Red Sox. And, he's ended up making $70-80 million from that point. Way more money than he made in his career up to age 36, just from a mindset shift and saying, wow, I actually have an amazing curveball. Why am I throwing my fastball so much? Right. It's just like, let's just live or die with this pitch that I have better than everybody else on earth.
I think you made a really good point there when they walk in and say, what do you got for me? And I think in the private training sector, obviously that's how everybody comes to Tread Athletics, is it's, what do you have for me? But talk about that on the coaching end, because I think that front-loaded initial conversation with the data points, knowing where his efficiency is, how pitches have performed historically, what his anatomical limitations are, how he naturally moves mechanically. Having all that information up front, talk about what that means as a coach then to create that buy-in, especially at the highest level, because those guys can certainly sort through if you're fluffing it a little bit.
You know, I preface every pitch design session or arsenal design session with, hey, we're going to iterate. Like, I don't know what's going to work, and I'm making crazy calculations on the fly. Part of my training was I didn't have TrackMan or Rapsodo for multiple spring trainings with the Red Sox. So on the backfields, I was literally calculating pitch data by just watching the seams with my eyes. And, you know, you can get close enough and you actually get pretty good at it over time. But, you know, a pitcher can walk in and you get into that pitch design session and say, hey, I'm going to have you throw 3 or 4 pitches with this grip. I'm going to watch it. I'm evaluating motor preferences. I'm evaluating how it's coming out of your hand. You know, is there synergy between the pitch and the plane that you operate in? Are we going in the right direction, wrong direction? I say, but ultimately, this is going to be fun. Let's be an athlete. I don't care. And a lot of times I'll say, I don't care about command. You know, I love when we throw a pitching dummy in there. I was like, hit him in the head. Like when you eliminate them judging themselves on bad reps, and you just take that totally out of the equation and they're just free to experiment. I said, this is a lab. We're just here to, when you walk out of here, I want you to be better than when you walked in. And I don't know what the answer is going to be, but we're going to run through a bunch of things. We're going to, you know, I was in advertising. We're going to A/B test things. Like, is this better than this? We're going to talk through. But like, you know, let's build up a sample, 3 or 4 of this group, 3 or 4 of this group. You know, and I start kind of taking them through a journey throughout the session. And they start to understand themselves better. They start to buy in because there's no pressure. They don't care if they launch it over the backstop. It was like, hey, you know, I'll pull up somebody famous that did the same thing. They're like, oh, he did it too. And you just find ways psychologically to bring down their tension level and just their apprehension and just allow them to kind of open up and engage in the session. And that's what's so fun about it. By the end of it, like, they don't want to stop throwing and like, we got to cut you off.
Right.
But like, they're so engaged in their own exploration and creativity and figuring out who they truly are and what the best version of all their pitches are, that you know, they can't wait for the next session. And that's when you know you've truly kind of created the right environment, when they're not walking out of there doubting you or going, why the heck did I do that? They're like, man, I wish I could throw more. Like, that's when you set it up right.
I think, speaking from an athlete standpoint, and you look at certain organizations who might be targeting various pitch design goals with individuals that might not favor the motor preferences. Like, in that pitch design, though, talk a little bit about how that relates back to the motor preference and how you're honing in on that specific thing.
You know, I'm probably quicker to cut off. You know, you can go a couple different ways in a session, and I'm probably quicker to just go, hey, I'm not going down that road. Okay, I see this working. Let's shift over here and let's go with this. Like, wherever we're gaining momentum in the session, like, let's go with it, because you get the buy-in. And I think I've just spent more years kind of exploring these abstract concepts, even though I can't quantify them. I just know it's happening, and I've seen enough pitchers, you know, just have these similar preferences or biases. And so I'm educating them on them. I'm comparing them to other pitchers that move the same way. Other sessions that I've done thousands of sessions now. You know, other sessions that are similar. Like, hey, here's how this session went for this famous pitcher, and he starts to relate and feel like, oh, I'm going down the same path he went down. And you just kind of like just lower the pressure, and really start to accelerate the strengths. I'm always about amplifying strengths and finding synergies, and you want a pitcher to do things that come naturally to him. And just because an organization says you got to throw a changeup, or, you know, this is the goal, I pivot quickly within a session. I'll go in a completely different direction, or I'll get a gut feeling or a hunch that, like, hey, this grip might be it, and let's switch. And I wasn't planning to do this, but I'm gonna take you there. And as long as I can keep the trust and bring the credibility to the table, because that's why a lot of guys, you know, want to sign with the Giants or want to work with me, is just they've seen other guys have results and they're curious on, like, how it happened. And so you kind of bring that credibility and buy-in to the table, and they start to have fun, especially when you nail something it's just like that aha moment, and you see their eyes light up, and they're like, I've never been able to throw that pitch before. And that's when you walk out of there kind of high-fiving each other. And that's the joy of it all. But it's all based on the psychology, the environment, the trust, and the track record, the credibility you bring to the table.
How fast will you really know that you've got something? Like if you, let's say you're going to try to play with a slider, will they usually get it the first time when you nail it? Like, are they immediately going to feel it? They're going to be like, that's it. That feels super comfortable. I can repeat it. Or will you give them 10, 15, pitches with a certain grip, finger placement, etc., before you decide to scrap it and move on, or stick with it and continue in that direction?
I think if you come prepared to the session, and like I said, if I know the tilt, if I know the spin efficiency, I'm watching quickly for the motor preferences, I'm watching quickly for the plane they're rotating on. Are they more north-south? Are they more east-west? And I'm creating all these comps in my head. If you can just dramatically shorten the exploration process, it gets really fun because you're just cutting off all the wasted reps, and you're actually, my 15 years of failure of doing this
Right.
allows me to know what doesn't work, and it just doesn't let the session get sidetracked or just a loss of confidence in the pitcher. When you rep off 7 pitches in a row and they're all terrible, and you don't have an answer for them, like, it's just not a good look. You really, there's almost a pace and a rhythm, and it's really a dance. Like, you're dancing with them, like you're trying to keep them motivated, because the more you can keep them invested in iterating through the right things, and it's just kind of like the branch of a tree. You're just trying to get to the end game, which is the right pitch with the right synergy, with the right execution, and that's when and the right contrast the rest of the pitches in the arsenal. That's when you've got it. And so I know usually within 5 pitches, maybe 3 or 4 grips that it could be, and I'm trying to avoid having to run through the 6 or 7 other grips that technically it could be, but that I know it probably isn't, because those are just wasted reps. There's probably a lower pitch quality, lower synergy, lower execution. But ultimately, if I can guide them faster, I think that's what you bring to the table as a coach.
So let's say we're not just looking at an individual session, but we're looking at like a 4-week long process. What does that look like? Is maybe the first session you're just trying to narrow in on like that slider grip, and then once you have the grip, the next couple sessions you're focusing more on things like finger position, finger pressure, cues, hand behind the ball, hand on the side of the ball, things like that, focal points. How do you like kind of narrow in on that, making that pitch really game ready once you've established maybe the grip in the first session? How does that evolve over like a 4-week period?
I call it nodal-based arsenal design. So what you're trying to find is a 3D release point for that pitcher, where all of a sudden, say right now he's got 3 pitches and they're all kind of just off by a little bit. And it's actually stepping back and say, I'm not going to organize his biomechanics with a preference towards greater performance. I'm actually going to organize his biomechanics with a preference towards hitting that 3-dimensional node, as I call it, where all of a sudden, maybe it's clipping 5% more spin efficiency on all 3 pitches, and maybe it also opens up a door for a 4th pitch with a seam shifted wake. And when you study enough pitchers, there's actually these 3D release points where all of a sudden, like, everything just works. And it might come at the sacrifice of a little bit of velo, but if you upgrade all 3 pitches plus maybe a new 4th with another grade on the pitch quality scale, the pitcher's way more productive.
Right.
And so it's these strategic decisions on, okay, Logan Webb's not going to throw 97 anymore. He's going to throw 93, but all of a sudden he's going to have like multiple 70 grade pitches, et cetera. Like, it's strategic sacrifices, putting the whole above the individual, maybe like radar gun readings. And so just getting into that style of arsenal design versus individual pitch design. Now you can get in there and just design an individual pitch if the other ones are very sound. Like, he's already in that right node where, okay, everything else looks good. This pitch is just off by a little bit. But a lot of times the lowest hanging fruit for a lot of pitchers that aren't productive are almost like reimagining what he should be, and kind of shifting, because you can use things like centrifugal force, inertia, Some really cool kind of invisible force in delivery, because once we get into max external rotation and we go to throw, pitchers don't think about what happens from there to there. The reflex happens so fast, but we can actually, like, I can shift a pitcher's release point horizontally by going a more horizontal stride angle and kicking it out a little further with centrifugal force. There's all these fun little things in addition to just grips, etc., that we can use to push pitchers into different release points that then actually shift all of his pitches on a movement plot into more desirable locations. So, it's kind of the holistic view of the arsenal versus just the individual view of one pitch at a time.
It seems like your kind of sweet spot is in that lab setting where it's experimenting, it's figuring out what works. How do you get that game ready? So like Logan Webb figures out the changeup in a bullpen session. Like, how do you now get him to be comfortable actually executing that in a game scenario? I don't know if that was a month later or a week later. Like, do you typically challenge them to go be able to do this against hitters on a short time frame, or do you want to be able to groove that for a month or 2 or 3 in the off season, have plenty of time to feel comfortable with that before they take it into the game? Or do you have guys where like they'll throw a bullpen, new grip, and they go and use it in the game the next day?
I think with the pitches that are meant to be, there's usually command within like 24 to 48 hours. Like, all of a sudden there's just this natural synergy with my cutter. I've heard Clayton Kershaw try to cutter grip, next day he's taking it out there. There's some pitches that take longer, like a splitter. So I think each pitch has a learning curve to it. So the simpler the pitch and the more fastball-like, I think the easier it is and the quicker the ramp up into game ready. But what I try to sell pitchers on is, let's improve your athleticism. Let's improve your pitch quality ceiling. Let's take it out there, because what happens is your improved pitch quality compensates for your short-term lack of command. Because you just have a bigger margin for error. You have that bigger buffer where you can miss, but that higher pitch quality, he still might foul it off. And then over time, as that proprioception builds and you get more reps in, now the command starts to dial in. So instead of trying to work on command with lower quality pitches, I immediately push towards higher quality arsenals and letting the command develop over time. I think it's actually a superior way to develop big league pitchers. Versus just working on command straight up.
Yeah, I want to read a quote from you, which I think I just retweeted a couple days ago. But you said, throwing strikes raises the floor of a pitching staff. This thrives in the regular season where efficiency is rewarded over a larger sample. Outlier pitch quality raises the ceiling of a pitching staff. Strikes can get you to the postseason. Outlier pitch quality wins in the postseason. Championship teams at all levels tend to have outlier pitch quality while maintaining above average strike throwing. Because so many coaches at the high school level, college level, they're like, just throw strikes, just throw strikes. You get the college level, it's the guy who throws like 87, but just throws strikes. That's the guy that gets all the innings. The guy who throws 94, but like sprays a little bit. A lot of times will not get as many innings. Like, what do you say to those coaches that are just so hesitant to stray from the guys that just have great command, but really poor stuff?
Strikes are so important. And that quote is not bashing strikes. It's, there's a couple interesting things that happen in the postseason. And it kind of depends if you're taking the approach, how often can we get to the postseason versus are we building the highest upside team possible, even though there's more, variability in our win-loss totals. But if we just get there, we could be devastating in a small sample series. And what's kind of interesting is, I remember a study from years ago. They said, what's the biggest advantage to home field advantage in the postseason? Because, really, is there an advantage? And the biggest difference was in the home plate umpire. He was actually influenced by the crowd. When you have 50,000 people cheering predominantly for one side on that super close pitch on the black, he's more likely to give it to the home team because he's going to get a favorable reaction. And that was kind of the point of the study, is that there are these things that happen in the postseason with regards to strike throwing that are not consistent with the regular season, where typically have less fans, the environment isn't as pressure cooker. So I think the same thing happens with both pitchers and hitters, is that I think hitters have worse strike zone discipline in the postseason, just because, I talk about sensory overload a lot. When you have everybody waving towels and screaming and they're playing, Kerncraft 400 and it's going nuts out there, like, it's really hard to determine, is that pitch half an inch off or not? And then along with the home plate umpire maybe being influenced by the crowd, etc., or just the pitcher being nervous. And I've been in the College World Series and threw the first pitch in the left-handed batter's box. I couldn't feel my legs, and so that was my first sensory overload moment. And so that's why I think, you see like the Red Sox, we got bounced in the first round in 16 and 17, and then we ran through it in 18. I think we got over kind of the sensory overload factor of the postseason, and you kind of become immune to it after a while once you've been there so many times. But I think just getting back to the original point, throwing strikes will get you to the postseason, but trying to face incredibly outlier stuff like what the Astros had in their pen, etc., it just becomes so hard to square up in the postseason with all the environmental factors that come along with it.
I know you're going to want to talk about the sensory overload side of this, but I want to go back to a little bit of that relative to sample size, because I think that pertains to training as well. Like we talk about the regular season, large sample size, postseason, obviously small. But talk about that in terms of making changes with pitchers, how many data points you're looking at. We would sit here, if we discussed a professional pitcher, we're looking at a minimum of 300, 400 plus pitches to even think about changes. But talk about that in terms of allowing guys to see a relatively large sample size when making adjustments and not jumping ship too quickly.
I think one of the easiest ways to just go about an arsenal is I never design pitches in a vacuum. I design relationships between pitches, that pitch pairings. And it's something that's very hard to quantify because you just talked about small sample on individual pitches and then trying to model the relationship between pitches. There might not, for an individual pitcher, there might not be anybody in the big leagues that has the exact pitch quality characteristics of him. And so you turn to your analyst like, hey, can you model this out? Like, relative to his fastball, how should we adjust this? They're like, well, there's not enough sample. And that's typically the reaction. So a lot of times you're doing it in theory. And that's kind of my sweet spot is I believe all the competitive advantages in baseball exist where there's either no data or it's hard to model things. Because if we can't do it, that means other teams are probably struggling with the same thing. And that means if you're actually hitting on something that's not yet quantified, now all of a sudden, and you're taking that risk reward of like, okay, I think there's signal here, and I'm going to go to it, but I can't actually prove it yet. But I'm just watching hitters react to it, and I was like, this is an upgrade for this guy. I think that's one of the coolest things to do is just dive into those areas where it's kind of mysterious still, and it's typically pitch pairings, pitch sequencing, visual deception, seam orientation, like. That's a deep rabbit hole that, there's still not machine learning. There's some entry level stuff on seam orientation, but I don't think anybody's fully calculated every possibility, even though we're getting closer. But just being able to dive into those areas ahead of everyone else can really give you those advantages.
You touched on that, the sensory overload piece of like playing in the postseason, or I can think my experience of that was like in college. My first outing was at Texas in front of 10,000 fans. I'd never pitched in front of more than 500 fans in high school. How do we train for that sensory overload piece? Do you think it's just obviously through experience and being there over time you get used to it? Can you train for that? Would you try to make bullpens more stressful? Would you ever add crowd noise, or we do like heckle bullpens here sometimes where your teammates try to distract you? Do you think there's any real way to simulate the stress of some of those really pressure postseason situations? And would you ever try to do that in a practice setting or in the off season?
I think, whether you've done Orange Theory or, Zone 4 on a heart monitor, if you put pitchers into that zone, a lot of them have never thrown practice bullpens with a really, really spiked heart rate. That's a great way to do it. Blasting speakers, having visual distractions like people waving towels. It's good to know how you're going to react when that happens. You don't have to do it for every session because it can kind of be overkill. But pitchers that have never experienced it, or even in a practice setting, not Rule 21 of baseball, but just bet on pitches. Like actually make it hurt if you don't execute. Bet $100, and it actually puts way more pressure on the execution in a practice setting. And some people don't handle it well, and they need more reps with more pressure on the line in order to be able to go out and execute it in a game.
Yeah, I think That's a powerful thing, and I want to go back to the bullpen setting, talking about that zone 4 heart rate. And something I want to segue that to is also low intent bullpens and how it affects data. I can't tell you how many guys throw a 70% bullpen, and all of a sudden, because of the inflation with TrackMan, they're carrying the ball at 23 and they think everything's great in the world. But talk about that in your pitch design, because we've talked about the motor patterns and we know how those kind of acclimate at higher efforts. So talk about, what type of perceived effort bullpen wise to really get the true effects.
So when a pitcher, when I need him to do a pitch design session that is going to sync up with what we want to see in a game, I need there to be a higher intent level. I'm a stickler for tempo. It's one of the things I watch for the most with pitchers is they're kind of oblivious to what their present tempo is versus their game tempo. And if you even just film it, even at 30 frames a second, you just count the frames. Like when you get to key points in the delivery, they're off by so many frames in a practice session relative to a game session. So just even building up that tempo in their delivery that allows them to get to the effort level where, once I talk about forward inertia a lot. What it does is it pushes the elbow into that horizontal adduction. And so you start losing spin efficiency. And you see it with guys. So at lower intensities, and you're not getting that forward inertia, you get the elbow in a further back position. And so you're just clipping pure backspin. And all of a sudden you tell them to throw 5 miles an hour harder. And all of a sudden their spin efficiency drops because now all of a sudden, they're throwing the ball more like a football as opposed to backspinning it perfectly. And so if you're not recreating the actual biomechanical positions that are going to occur in a game via the intensity levels, I think you're just wasting your time because you're just not getting that proprioception. It's not quality practice. So I'd rather have a pitcher throw less pitches overall from a volume perspective and just hit those velo levels we need to see what's actually happening at game intensity to get a true read on those pitch shapes and how the pitches interact with each other.
Do you find that there's still value for certain pitchers who do like to do, let's say, dry reps on their own time to feel out something mechanically? Like, do we still encourage them to do that on their own if they like to? It's just when you're actually doing a pitch design session and evaluating the movement and the arsenal, you want to see that minimum intensity hit? Or do you think that like 50% dry reps on like an off day is also kind of a waste of time, or depends on the guy?
I'm just a big believer in spending more time on the mound. So I'm okay with a pitcher just from a feel perspective, throwing pitches at a lower intensity. But if you're going to do that, I'd rather have you do it on a slope.
Right.
I'm not a big believer. There's a huge difference. And when you're on flat ground, you're not dealing with gravity and it just changes everything. So there's guys that just want to go out there, Glavine will go out there and just work on his changeup. So guys that throw off-speed pitches, I think it's a little more valuable to get your reps in at lower intensities because it's a feel pitch, especially if you have a velo differential changeup versus more of an action-based changeup. He would go out there and just 50% intensity, he'd set up strings and just try to dot his changeup to the knees. And he was comfortable taking that into a game, and he had done it so many tens of thousands of times, he could do it. So I think it's pitcher dependent, just customizing the practice to the needs of the game. If you are more of a Kyle Wright, like throwing 85-mile-an-hour curveballs, I'd rather you throw less pitches overall and go out there and try to recreate that versus trying to throw it at 75. I think there's less value in that if ultimately that's what defines you as a pitcher.
So one question that we were hoping to ask you was in regards to how much data, how much information do we actually share with players versus how much do we kind of filter before actually sharing it with the players? So what are your thoughts on that? Because some organizations that we, will work with players, certain orgs, they'll share all their TrackMan data, they'll share everything, and just kind of like it's on them to learn it and get up to speed. Other teams won't share any of the data, any of the video, and they're just very, very protective about that, and they don't want to overload guys with too much information. So how do you do that? Do you filter with certain guys if they're more cerebral, less cerebral? Is it more of a feel-based thing as a coach? What are your thoughts on kind of sharing data, sharing all this information with guys, empowering them versus overloading them?
I think I take a more customized approach in that I tell them, I want you to be a better coach of yourself than I am a coach of you. And the only way I can get you there is by giving you the information you need to know in order to make pitch-to-pitch adjustments on the mound. And for each guy, that's going to be a different amount of information. I'm always blown away when an organization shares nothing with a player. It's just like, complaining, getting new shoes, complaining that they hurt your feet for a long time, and then somebody down the road tells you, well, like, that's the wrong shoe for you.
Right.
Like, how do we not at least, I call TrackMan like a pitcher MRI. Like, how do we never tell a player like what's actually going on with them? Because that means they're always making subjective adjustments out there because they have no objective reference points. And so some pitchers are cerebral, and I'll actually simplify it for them. Some players, I'll challenge them to be a little more cerebral in order to just be a little more aware and not oblivious out there to things that impact their career and their production and their earnings potential. So I think that's where we joke that as pitching coaches, we're more psychologists than anything. It's a filtering process, but not in a deceptive way. It's to enhance how that player needs to absorb information and the amount they need to have, and then work with them to better implement it, because some pitchers like the data, but then they don't actually know how to make it actionable.
Right.
And so you're trying to walk them through each step of the process. But once again, it's always a customized process. So I hate blanket philosophies. It's just like, why can we not customize it to the player if we have that capability?
But if a player himself is actively seeking out and hungry for more information, like let's say you give him the very simplified version, he wants more, he wants to learn. Is there ever a point where you're like, no, I refuse to let you go down this path, or will you allow him to kind of guide that own discovery process?
I think the hardest point for any player, and I've been there, is admitting that you're actually pitching at your ceiling. Pitchers are tinkerers, pitchers are cerebral. I was a little of both, and it's hard to admit that like I might be actually pitching at the best version of me right now. And now it's just about going out and being as consistent at that as possible. Some pitchers hate hearing that. And sometimes it's the most important thing you can tell them is like, you're the best version of you. And it might disappoint them because they want to be, a Cy Young winner or an all-star. And that's a great goal. But they're going to get there by being more consistent with their preparation, routines, practice sessions, and execution out there versus chasing some other version of themselves. And we have to know as coaches when that is. But I think it starts with openly sharing information with them, but giving them, it's just like somebody who's trying to be on a good diet. Like, you're trying to serve them a plate full of food that's appropriate for their goals. You're not trying to give them too much food or too little food or starve them. You're just trying to give them the right amount. And so that's kind of how we approach it.
Again, working with big leaguers, they're more likely to be pitching at their ceiling than a high school or college kid. Like, I would say very few of the guys that come to us are pitching at their ceiling where we would have to have that tough conversation, but you're obviously encountering that significantly more often.
And the tricky part is there's a lot of pitchers that have reached their ceiling in one version of themselves, but if they're pitching in the wrong style, there's a whole new untapped version. So they might be running into a wall, with velo or pitching in a linear style, but all of a sudden you realize, oh, this guy might be a seam effects guy, and there's a whole new side to him. And then, you're trying to transition them out of that. And so it's just keeping them along in the journey and being very transparent with them. You're never trying to sell them on something they can't accomplish, because you can screw them up that way too. You just take them down a rabbit hole that is never going to yield any fruit. But I think that's the beauty of the process, is just because we have all this data, it's who communicates it the best, who gives the players the right amount, and it's also the timing. If a player is going good, like, you don't need to give him more data. Like, just let him go be good. Those are all the subjective judgments that I think make for good analysts and good coaches.
I'm curious to ask you about what you think the role of the private sector, if any, is in development of pros or pro organizations, because again, they primarily have these players half of the year or 2/3 of the year, and then these players are off at home. They're training somewhere, they're throwing somewhere, they have some coach somewhere. So do you feel like there can be that synergy there with private facilities, with private coaches, or is that still something that where you need to be very protective about who they're working with and vet that very closely? What do you think the role of the private sector, if any, is in that overall success that an organization might have?
I'm really big on players. I think in baseball, the schedule is so long. It's grueling. It's a marathon. I'm a big believer in work-life balance. I think holistically taking care of the player, like they need to be home with their families if they have kids to be a good dad. And so instead of fighting the private facility world, I actually think the private facility world has gotten ahead of organizations in some areas as being able to customize things to a little finer degree, just because you're just able to provide the players with what they need, as opposed to your job is literally riding on, is this player going to pan out? Like, a top
Right.
draft pick, if you don't turn him into the big leaguer that he's supposed to be based on where you draft him, there's career risk there. Versus a facility can just pivot or go, hey, we're actually seeing something different. What do you think about going in this direction? And you know, tech has leveled the playing field. There used to be a disparity, and now facilities have just as much or even more tech and data and the data pipeline that major league orgs do. And so, if you actually build relationships with those facilities and view them as parts of your team and integrate them into the process, we're bringing facilities into our Zoom calls now, because we're trying to hand off our players to where they can spend time with their family in the off season, get elite level training, elite level data. There's great communication. We know they're being taken care of, versus if you either fight that process or you're at war with private facilities, or your player's just off doing who knows what, maybe he's just fishing all off season and he shows up not ready to go. That's the worst case scenario. So we saw during COVID, our pitchers actually get better, because I don't think the minor league season is even the optimal way to train pitchers or prepare them to pitch in the big leagues. So we were actually able to see this kind of hybrid training format where there were a lot less games and a lot more training, and we saw significant performance upgrades in our pitchers. And so I think the world of the major league organization and the private facility is still evolving, but I think the teams that embrace it and have better relationships and promote it and take care of their pitchers throughout the calendar year, as opposed to, trying to, talk them out of it, or then not knowing what their pitchers are doing and just kind of leaving them on their own. Those guys are going to fall behind, and the orgs that do embrace it are going to get ahead of the field.
In a lot of ways, it's that off season where you really can be tinkering, you can be experimenting. There's no risk of screwing a guy up in October, right? Like you're not having to go out and perform the very next day. So that is the time where a lot of the development can be happening. One of the things we've kind of encountered is that as long as we view this as a collaborative process with the teams, like it doesn't become this threatening thing. It's like, hey, we're just an extra set of eyes. We're going to be evaluating some things that might be a little bit different from what you're evaluating. Let's have that conversation and let's be on the same page before we recommend any sort of major changes. And you frame it in that, from that standpoint, it's no longer this threat. It's no longer, is this pitcher going to come back in spring training completely changed, completely ruined? It's like, oh, there's some trust built there. There's a relationship built there. Everyone's on the same page, fighting for the exact same goals to help this player be the best version of themselves. So I hopefully that's the future of the game, the future that things go, so that players can have half of the year to be with their family, to unwind, to focus on their development, while still having that organization fully looped into what's going on.
I think you're so different with being a director of pitching who's very outgoing and engaging. And I reflect back to like our first phone call. I was in Durham at the time, and we spoke for an hour about biomechanical principles and data. But I reflect on that, and we spoke about similar things with Seam Shift and looking for the right profiles. And that certainly helped me on the developmental side, looking at data, coaching guys. But on the other side of this, we're talking about how the private sector can help athletes, ultimately, like they're assets of your organization. However, I also know that we have 100+ free agents who will likely be signed this year. And for me to think, okay, well, I know very well what Banny knows, what he's really good at. I think that also creates a culture fit of like, hey, and I'm sure I've texted you about dozens of guys with this, but it's like, I think he's going to go be a good fit with you now. And I think there's immense value there too.
I think there's organizations, and I'll readily admit, that serve certain styles of pitchers better than others, just because it's almost like their entire pitching pipeline is aligned along one principle in favor of a different principle. And so if the pitcher fits that style, there's just enough people, on medical, on mental skills, on the S&C side, et cetera, that kind of have their own personal strengths in a certain style of pitching, that there's a ton of synergy there. And, I try to know a lot about a lot of styles and really challenge myself to handle any type of pitcher that represents a good value for our organization and that I feel like I can add value to his career and reciprocate. But I do think in certain circumstances, if a pitcher's choosing between a couple different orgs, there is an advantage to going with one over another just because their philosophy on everything he is going to do as a pitcher matches up a lot better.
Just to kind of end up here, I wanted to get kind of specific with certain pitch types, but also I wanted to touch on this idea of seam shifted wake and explaining that concept to like a 10-year-old, because it's something we've broken down quite a bit here in our videos, but there's still a lot of confusion around exactly what seam shifted wake is. Maybe it's just because it's a kind of confusing term. How do you explain the concept of seam shifted wake to a 10-year-old, and then what would be one or two tips you would give a 10-year-old, 12-year-old, doesn't matter the age, if they're trying to explore this world of like seam effects on, let's say, a sinker?
So my favorite analogy, I was able to successfully develop the seam shifted wake with a lot of 10 to 12-year-olds. But the way that I go about explaining it is I try to use a common object that's a little more, that they're a little more aware of. And so what I use is an airplane wing. And so, when I tell them, like, when you go on an airplane, how do you think this big old heavy airplane full of people goes up in the sky? And it's a concept called lift. But really all it is you have the bottom of the airplane wing is flat and the top of it is curved, so that when the airplane's going fast and the air is coming over the wing, it has to go a further distance over the top of the wing because it's a curved path. And so the air above the wing gets spread thinner, the air molecules. And so anytime you have low pressure relative to high pressure, the air underneath the wing is just going straight past. All of a sudden, it pushes the airplane up. And so the same thing happens on a baseball. When you have a flat side of the baseball, which is like the bottom of an airplane wing, and then you have a seam on the edge of the baseball, which is like the top curved part of the wing, the air going over the seam has to go over that speed bump, and it gets spread a little thinner. So you have low pressure on one side of the ball, you have high pressure on the other side of the ball, and so the ball tends to go in the direction of the low pressure. It's how wind works. It's how, weather systems work. They go from high pressure to low pressure. And so when I use that airplane wing analogy, they start to understand it because they're sitting there trying to process, well, how does an airplane fly? And once they make that correlation, then they're like, okay, if I can do that same thing with a baseball where one side is flat, one side has a curved or kind of bump on it, now all of a sudden that's what I'm trying to achieve. And as long as you're using some kind of higher frame rate camera, I mean, iPhone is borderline, but there's some, you don't have to go full Edgertronic. Using something as a reference, they can actually start to try to achieve it. And not every pitcher is a candidate to do it. But for those that are, I quickly tell them, hey, I think you're a candidate for a seam shifted wake. So I give them that analogy. And then once they actually see it in action, you get this big smile on their face because all of a sudden they see way more movement and later movement on their pitches. And it's just a really fun process because I call it a physics trick, is because that's really what it is. And now they feel empowered that they know something and can do something that other pitchers can't.
So what's one tip you would give a kid who's interested in learning a seam shifted wake sinker? Just trying a one seam grip, or looking at just getting a slow motion camera and seeing how the ball comes off their fingers, or just trying a generic two seam grip? Like, what's one thing they can try to see if that's even something that might work for them?
Probably the easiest way is either draw, similar to those balls over there, draw like a quarter size black circle on one side of the ball because you need a two seam orientation. And so if when you're looking at the ball flying towards home, if you can see the black dot facing you a little bit, you might be a candidate for a seam shifted wake. And so the other way is to just draw a line around the equator of the ball vertically. And if it's spinning and it's a little tilted to the side, it's not right in the middle, you might be a candidate. And so there is an exploration element to it, because a lot of pitchers that do it aren't linear pitchers. They actually are more rotational pitchers. You see Logan Webb, Brandon Webb, Greg Maddox, like Tom Glavine, a lot of them are very rotational in nature. They're not just like heavy linear like Nolan Ryan or Tom Seaver or Spencer Strider, Jake DeGrom, all those guys. And that's part of how they create that effect. But that's a good way, good little litmus test, just like, am I a candidate? And then, to do it, you're actually going to be more on the outside of the baseball than trying to pronate it. So that's another part of the concept is the seams create your movement. Your hand doesn't create the movement. So you got to get them over that mental hurdle that the ball can still go the opposite direction of where my hand placement is.
What about fastball vert? So whatever pitcher is watching this, they've decided, and maybe it doesn't match their profile, but maybe they have gone through that and they've decided they want to try to add 2-3 inches of vert to their four seam. Do you have one or two kind of key tips, things that have worked in the past, pressure, grip, things like that, to increase fastball vert?
I think the easiest way is a slightly higher slot. To preface it, I actually am anti fastball vert. I actually like middle ranges of spin efficiency because I think there's more arsenal potential and creativity. Now there are going to be pitchers that are known for their vert. It's generally easier to be productive if you're a left-hander with heavy fastball vert. The Sean Doolittles of the world, like Jake McGee, like you can go out there and blow fastballs with high vert and be really successful. For righties, unless you have complementary pitches that also go down, chasing more vert, I think, can actually weaken your arsenal because now you're above barrels most of the time and you're struggling to get under barrels. Because usually as you're adding spin efficiency, and I gave this ABCA webinar on spin efficiency, and as you add spin efficiency, it actually gets harder to throw secondary pitches because now your hand is more like a high five at release as opposed to being, somewhere more karate chop. So usually secondary power goes down, vertical depth on secondary goes down, or goes up. And so I actually generally don't coach pitchers into more vert on their fastball unless it's just some kind of extreme scenario where we can also successfully design a splitter or something else to contrast it and move in an opposite direction. Because I've found it just generally weakens the arsenal. So, the clean fuego is like a great tool to help. But I generally try to get what we call seam replacement out of it, as opposed to trying to increase spin efficiency out of it. Because as the hand just gets more square, it generally comes at the expense of the secondary pitches.
Gotcha. So we already kind of touched on the sinker example, sinker depth. Typically, if you get seam effects, you're going to, increase depth on the sinker. You're going to increase arm side movement. What about slider sweep? So seam effects on a slider, someone trying to get, from let's say 5 inches of horizontal to 15 or 20 inches of horizontal. What's the first thing you might look at, or what are two tips they can try to implement to work on that?
There is a genetic component to it. We've talked a little bit about motor preferences. The other interesting thing is that the wrist, if you're naturally supinated at the wrist, and so that my experience has been over the years is that a lot of pitchers with good sweepers actually fail pronation tests. Like their insertion points and just their natural anatomy is a little biased towards supination. And so what's cool about that is in an overhand arm slot, if you're supinated, you're losing spin efficiency, but then as you go to lower arm slots, you're actually using what I call reverse tilt. So it's not a measured data point, but it's kind of just is the ball tipped backwards, which helps the pitch serve to kind of float across the zone. So that natural supination, once you go into a lower slot, it goes from low spin efficiency to actually tipping the ball backwards. So it kind of depends where your slot is at on the impact it has on the ball. So when the ball's tipped backwards, it actually helps keep it up in the air and it can help improve that H break. So what you're trying to determine is, are you more of a gyro slider pitcher where you're kind of in that middle range of 3 to 7 inches of horizontal break, or are you actually getting that tipped back effect, that reverse tilt, where you can get into the 10 to 18 inches of H break on a bigger sweeper? You're just trying to figure out between your motor preference and your natural anatomy, what category are you in? Because I think that helps determine which pitch shape you're chasing. With less H break, you chase more velo. with more H break, you're trying to just dial in the consistency of that shape and then make sure you have, whether you call it a bridge pitch or something else to pair it with, because it can be hard to command. And if there's not a smaller pitch to go with it, it can be really hard to throw strikes consistently.
What about a changeup? Do you kind of coach the seam effects on changeup, or do you more go for the classic pronating a changeup, getting on the inside of the ball, and trying to get arm side movement that way?
I think what's been fun is, Logan Webb, Johnny Cueto had seam effects changeups, and then Kevin Gosman had a seam effects splitter that we were able to keep them all dialed in on. So those are really elite level changeups, because when you get that later, better movement with the seam effects, it just results in higher pitch quality. But I think this pitch has the most options of any pitch. You can either kill spin rate, you can go for more of the Magnus version, you can go for more of the cut spin, splitter shape version. You'll see Kyle Hendricks do that. You can go so many ways. Devin Williams, the 3,000 RPM version. There's almost no rules to it. It's just getting it into pitch quality ranges where it's unique and outlier and contrasts your other pitches, especially your fastball, really well. So some pitchers throw it 90 miles an hour. Some pitchers go 15 miles an hour velo differential. It's a wild, wild west of any of the pitches, and I think that's what makes changeup so much fun.
Specifically with that example, like let's say you have a changeup that's, I don't know, 5 vert, 20 horizontal, and you have one pitcher who's getting that with seam effects and one pitcher who's not getting as many seam effects. Are those two pitches the same in your eyes, or do you value the later break that's happening as a result of the seam shifted wake over just seeing those metrics on a TrackMan?
I think as I've gotten better at seam orientation, I actually have been coaching pitchers into less H break overall. Once you get beyond the width of the plate, the 17 inches, I think you actually start negatively affecting command, and you're almost chasing so much H break in one direction that it gets hard to maintain the balance of all the other pitches that complement that pitch. So I'd rather go less H break, but with seam effects, than more Magnus H break, getting into those crazy, 20-inch ranges where, it looks like a Frisbee up there. But then I think it's hard for the pitcher to land. It's hard for the umpire to call it consistently. I think swing decisions actually get easier because in an East-West Arsenal, it stops tunneling as well. So I'd rather chase a smaller shape with more power or more seam effects as opposed to just creating this fun shape to look at where everybody watching it, it's
Right.
visually pleasing, but I think it's less productive overall.
I think you have a unique perspective on that too, from being a major league pitcher. I know tons of people just want to chase raw stuff, but you brought up tunneling, and I know in our data videos it's been like a very popular question: is tunneling real? Is obviously spin mirroring is hard to achieve, but movement mirroring is certainly real. But for you to mention tunneling, do you think you really value that based on your experiences as a pitcher?
I've been getting to the point I stop chasing total movement and I start pushing velo with tighter movement. I especially as major league hitters get better and better and better, and they almost become immune to velo. Nobody's immune to velo, but their tolerance for velo goes up as the average velo of the league goes up. I've found that the tighter arsenals with less spread but more power perform better. And so it's fun on Rapsodo or TrackMan to go, wow, 20 inches of H break, when sometimes 12 to 14 inches of H break with 2 to 3 more miles an hour of velo ends up actually performing better on a predictive level. So that just comes with kind of experience and wisdom. And I also see pitchers altering biomechanics just to hit more H break when you start to see it comes at the sacrifice of their ability to throw a cutter off of it or some other pitch, and it's not a good trade-off.
That's a powerful thing that I try to be very cognizant of in the private sector, and something you touched on is the biomechanical factors to cheat to get to a certain movement. Like I know as the sweeper became very prominent, I remember last year vividly in lives sitting there, and how prevalent tipping is in the game today and video analysis with that. And you can touch on that if you want. But I remember just watching guys come set, and if he came set with more counter rotation and the shoulders stayed level for a longer period of time, didn't get to that like B posture, like instantly I'm saying it's a slider. But talk about how you view that, especially at the major league level.
And I think that's where whether you want to call it Stuff Plus or, like a driveline blob, like those are unbelievable tools. And for a pitcher who's trying to build out his arsenal for the first time, getting to more valuable spots on a movement plot can be extremely valuable because you are increasing pitch quality. But if you're not simultaneously doing it without tipping in order to get to those movement plots or points on a movement plot, you're actually, I think, helping the hitter because he either is going to make better swing decisions or have a better swing preparation for that pitch type, knowing that it's coming. And major league clubs have entire teams dedicated to finding those tips. And you feel good about it in the off season. You're like, man, I'm hitting new metrics with this pitch. And then you get blown up during the season and trying to figure out why. So you have to think about everything holistically. Like you can't do it at the expense of tipping. You have to be able to maintain your biomechanics and achieve either better pitch shapes or what I prefer, throw it a little harder or add some seam shift via grip change. That's a better way to go about it at the highest level.
Brian, thanks so much for being here.
No, that's fun.
Had a blast. Hopefully we can do it again sometime.
Oh, for sure.
Appreciate it.
I've been wanting to get down here for a while.
Yeah.
Anytime, come on by.
Yeah.